You ever have one of those moments where the world goes quiet, and all you can hear is the sound of your own heart pounding in your ears? That was me yesterday, standing in the middle of the office as Emma, my wife and my boss, ripped me apart in front of everyone. And right behind her, sitting with a smug grin plastered across his face, was her boss, Ethan, the man who, up until recently, I thought was just a colleague. I'll get to that. It was a normal morning, or so I thought. I had my reports ready for the big quarterly meeting, nothing special, just the usual grind. Emma had been acting weird for weeks, colder, more distant, but I brushed it off. I figured we were both stressed. She had been working insane hours, and I wasn't exactly coasting through the easiest workload myself. But something about her was different, something I couldn't put my finger on. The meeting started, and Emma walked in like a storm. Late, tense, and pissed off, but that wasn't out of character. She had that energy when things needed to get done. I was used to it, but then she did something that caught me completely off guard. She didn't just criticize my work. She attacked me. Personally. Publicly. "Mark," she began, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you even realize how much of a burden you are to this team?" I blinked, completely thrown. My stomach twisted as the room went dead silent. Every eye suddenly glued to the spectacle unfolding in front of them. I wasn't just a random employee, I was her husband, and she was treating me like I was dirt. "I don't know how much longer I can tolerate this," she continued, her voice sharp and biting. "Honestly, if you keep this up, you'll be left without pay. We don't need dead weight around here." The blood drained from my face. This wasn't just professional frustration. There was something venomous in her tone, something personal. Everyone in that room knew we were married, but Emma didn't care. She was setting fire to our relationship right in front of them, and it felt like I was the only one who didn't understand why. That's when I saw him, Ethan, sitting in the corner, leaning back in his chair, watching the whole thing unfold like it was a scene from a movie. He wasn't even trying to hide his satisfaction. His lips curled into a grin, a quiet, amused smirk that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the kind of smile you give when you're watching your subordinate handle business. No, this was something else, something darker. Ethan was Emma's boss, the real top dog. He'd always been around, hovering in the background, but lately, I'd noticed him more and more. Late-night calls with Emma, meetings that seemed to last hours, and those little inside jokes between them that never sat right with me. But I trusted her, or at least I had trusted her. Now, standing there with everyone watching me, Ethan's grin told me everything I didn't want to know. This wasn't just about work. Emma wasn't just angry about a project or some report. This was deeper, and Ethan was in the middle of it. The room was silent, except for the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. Emma, still glaring at me, didn't notice the way my eyes darted between her and Ethan. Or maybe she did and she just didn't care. At that moment, it was like I wasn't even there anymore. I was an obstacle, something in the way of whatever was going on between them. Couldn't breathe. I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. The humiliation of being dressed down like that in front of the team, the realization that Ethan's smug look wasn't just amusement. It was satisfaction. Like he'd won something. I mumbled something about needing to leave, barely keeping my voice steady, and walked out of the room. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Because if I had, I knew I'd see them. Emma standing tall, confident, and Ethan, still smiling that knowing, triumphant smile. Whatever was happening, whatever had been going on behind my back, I knew one thing for sure. My marriage wasn't just in trouble. It was on the verge of collapse. And I had no idea what I was going to do next. I left the office that day with my head spinning, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I couldn't think straight. Emma, my wife, had just humiliated me in front of everyone. And Ethan, that smug bastard, sat there like he knew something I didn't, like he'd been in on a secret I wasn't privy to, one that involved my wife. I drove around for hours after leaving the office, not sure where to go or what to do. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought it might snap. The worst part? I still didn't have any real proof. All I had were gut feelings, suspicions, and that damn smile on Ethan's face. but it was enough to send my mind spiraling, connecting dots that maybe didn't even exist, but God, it felt like they did. I thought back to the last few months, the late nights, the business dinners that always seemed to go later than expected. The way Emma's phone would light up with messages from Ethan, her face softening as she read them, brushing me off whenever I asked what was so important. I didn't want to be that guy, you know? The paranoid husband who sees betrayal in every text and side glance. But now I was starting to wonder if I should have been paying a lot more attention. When I finally got home, it was late. Emma wasn't there. No surprise. She'd probably told me earlier that she had to stay late again. Another meeting, another deadline, and I, like an idiot, hadn't questioned it. I poured myself a drink, sat in the dark living room, and waited. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to say, but I knew we couldn't go on like this. Not after what had happened at the office. It was close to midnight when she finally walked through the door. She didn't see me at first, sitting there in the shadows. She was on her phone, texting furiously with a slight smile on her lips. That same one she used to give me when we first started dating. I felt sick to my stomach. When she finally looked up and saw me, her smile dropped instantly, replaced by a look of annoyance. "Oh, you're still up?" she asked, slipping her phone into her bag like she had something to hide. "I told you I'd be late, Mark." "I remember," I said, my voice low, steady. Too steady, considering the storm brewing inside me. "Had a fun night?" She shot me a look. "I was working. What's your problem?" I stood up slowly, crossing the room to face her. "What happened today, Emma? At the office? You humiliated me in front of the entire team. And Ethan, he was sitting there watching it all like it was some kind of show." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. You know how stressful this project is. I didn't mean to snap. You just weren't pulling your weight. It's not personal." "Not personal?" I repeated, barely holding back the anger surging through me. "You tore me apart in front of everyone. You threatened to dock my pay. You called me the worst. That's not work, Emma. That's something else." "And what the hell was that with Ethan?" Her face tightened at the mention of his name, just for a second. But it was enough. "Ethan's my boss, Mark," she said, her voice suddenly calm, measured. "You're acting paranoid." "Am I?" I shot back. "Because it sure looked like there was something going on between the two of you." That's when she laughed. A cold, hollow laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "You're jealous of Ethan?" she asked, shaking her head like I was some kind of idiot. "Seriously? He's my boss. We work together. That's it. You're being ridiculous." But I wasn't buying it. Not this time. I could see it in her eyes, that flicker of something she was trying to hide. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I don't care what you say. I know there's something more. The way you look at him, the way he looks at you. You think I'm blind." She didn't answer right away, just crossed her arms and looked past me, avoiding my gaze. That's when I knew. The silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. And for the first time, it all clicked. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the coldness that had seeped into our marriage like a poison. I wasn't being paranoid. I was seeing things clearly for the first time. "You can keep lying," I said, my voice barely above a whisper now. "But I'm not going to sit here and pretend nothing's happening." Emma's eyes snapped back to mine, colder than ever. "What do you want me to say, Mark? Huh? That I've been spending too much time at work? That Ethan respects me more than you ever did? You're so insecure. It's pathetic." I felt the sting of her words, but I wasn't backing down. "I'm not talking about respect. I'm talking about what's really going on. Behind my back." For a moment, she just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving me standing there in the dark, my mind racing, my heart broken into 1,000 pieces. I didn't need her to say it. I already knew. The night after our confrontation, I barely slept. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to wrap my head around everything. Emma had gone to bed without another word, like nothing had happened, like we hadn't just shattered something between us that might never be fixed. I could still hear her breathing softly beside me, completely unbothered, while my mind raced, replaying every moment of the last few months, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. The next morning, she acted like nothing had changed. She got up, got dressed, made coffee, and headed out the door for work without so much as a glance in my direction. I didn't say anything either. I wasn't ready for another argument. I was still trying to figure out my next move. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Once she left, I grabbed her laptop. She rarely took it with her to work. She did most of her stuff on her office computer anyway. I felt a pang of guilt as I booted it up. Snooping wasn't something I ever thought I'd do. But after the way she treated me, after that look between her and Ethan, I needed answers. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I wasn't prepared for what I found. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, the usual work emails, spreadsheets, and projects. But then I found a folder buried in her downloads. It was labeled simply personal, and inside were screenshots. Hundreds of them, texts, messages, photos, and not just between Emma and her friends or family. No, this was between her and Ethan. My stomach twisted as I scrolled through the texts, feeling my chest tighten with every message. They weren't explicit, at least not in the way you'd expect, but they were enough. The way they talked, the way they flirted was all too familiar. Inside jokes, late-night texts about meetings that went well past work hours, comments about how good she looked in certain outfits. And then there was one that stopped me cold. "I can't wait to see you tonight. I've missed you," Ethan had written. Emma's reply was worse. "I've missed you too. You're the only thing keeping me sane through all this." That was dated 2 nights ago. 2 nights when she told me she was working late at the office, pushing through a deadline. The bile rose in my throat as I realized what that meant. She wasn't just spending extra hours at the office. She was with him right under my nose. My hands shook as I closed the laptop. I didn't need to see any more. The proof was right there, staring me in the face, and it felt like a punch to the gut. I had been an idiot. I had let this go on for too long, trusting her when she was doing everything behind my back with her boss. And the worst part? She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. The pieces started falling into place. The late-night work sessions, the coldness at home, the way Ethan had smiled at me during that meeting while she humiliated me in front of the entire office. He knew. He knew what was going on, and he enjoyed every second of it. The smug satisfaction in his eyes wasn't just him watching a power play. It was him knowing that he had taken something from me. Couldn't stay still. The anger boiling inside me was too much to contain. I had to get out of the house, had to clear my head before I did something I'd regret. So I grabbed my keys and drove, no real destination in mind, just needing to escape the suffocating weight of what I had just discovered. As I drove, the emotions hit me in waves. First, there was shock, the disbelief that this was actually happening. That my wife, the woman I had trusted for years, had been cheating on me with her boss. Then came the sadness, this deep, hollow ache in my chest, like a part of me had been ripped out. But what lingered most of all was the anger. A burning, seething rage that made my hands grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to confront her. I wanted to storm into her office and throw the screenshots in her face, demand answers, make her admit to everything. But I stopped myself. Not yet. I needed to think. I needed a plan. I parked in an empty lot, staring out at the passing cars, and tried to breathe through the fury. There was no easy way to handle this, no clean resolution where I'd come out unscathed. My marriage was crumbling, and I had to decide whether I was going to burn it to the ground or try to salvage something from the ashes. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to save it. Not anymore. Not after everything I'd seen, everything she'd done. Emma wasn't the woman I thought she was, and Ethan, that bastard, had been playing me for a fool this entire time. The idea of staying with her, of pretending we could fix this, made me sick. I couldn't just let her walk away from this unscathed. Not after what she'd done to me, to our marriage. I wasn't going to be her victim. I wasn't going to let her and Ethan laugh behind my back while they got away with it. No, If Emma wanted to play this game, I was going to make damn sure she regretted it. Once the anger settled into something more manageable, sharper, more focused, I knew what I had to do. Emma and Ethan thought they had control, thought they could string me along, humiliate me in front of the office, and keep their little affair hidden. But they were wrong. I wasn't just going to walk away, licking my wounds. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd meet them on their level. When I got home, the house was quiet. Emma still wasn't back from work, and for the first time I was glad. I needed time to plan, to think things through. Every fiber in my body screamed to confront her right then and there, to throw the evidence in her face and watch her squirm. But if I wanted to hurt her the way she had hurt me, I had to be smart about this. I poured myself a drink and sat down at the kitchen table, pulling out my phone. First, I backed up all the screenshots I'd found. Every last message between her and Ethan, every late-night flirtation, every lie she told me. I wasn't going to risk losing that proof. I'd need it when the time came. Then I called my lawyer. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but we'd been friends long enough that I knew he'd give it to me straight. When he picked up, I wasted no time. "John," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, "I need some advice. It's about Emma." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. John knew Emma, knew our relationship. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cautious. "She's cheating on me," I replied flatly. "With her boss. I have proof. Texts, messages, everything." I heard him sigh heavily, the kind of sigh that told me he wasn't surprised. "Mark, I'm sorry. That's tough. But listen, if you've got proof, you need to protect yourself. Don't confront her just yet. You need to play this smart. Document everything. And we'll talk about how to handle the divorce when you're ready." Divorce. The word hit me like a ton of bricks, but it was the only logical outcome. I couldn't stay with her after this. I couldn't even look at her without feeling disgusted. But I wasn't just going to roll over and give her the upper hand. No, I had to make sure that when I left, I'd leave her in ruins. "Thanks, John," I said, hanging up the phone. His advice was exactly what I needed. The confirmation that I had to wait, that confronting her now would be a mistake. I had to be patient. I had to gather more than just those texts. I had to be ready for her to try and manipulate the situation when the time came. But in the meantime, I needed something else. Something that would shake her, rattle her confidence, and make her feel what I'd been feeling since that day in the office. If Emma wanted to keep her little secret, I'd make sure that secret started to crumble, bit by bit. I decided to start with work. After all, that's where this all began. Emma had humiliated me in front of our colleagues, and Ethan had sat there watching like a predator toying with its prey. It was time to return the favor. The next day, I went in early, long before Emma or Ethan usually arrived. I had no interest in dealing with either of them just yet, but I needed to make sure everything was set in motion before they walked in. I approached one of my coworkers, Emily, who had always been kind to me, always watching from the sidelines with a sympathetic look whenever Emma lashed out at me in the office. She was one of the few people I trusted. "Hey, Emily," I said, keeping my tone casual but urgent. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" She glanced up from her desk, sensing the seriousness in my voice, and nodded. We stepped into the break room, away from the rest of the team. "What's going on?" she asked, her brow furrowing in concern. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell her part of the truth. "I think something's going on with Emma and Ethan. I've noticed things between them. I need to get to the bottom of it, but I need someone in the office who can help me keep an eye on them." Discreetly. Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't seem shocked. "Honestly, Mark, I've suspected something for a while now. The way they act around each other. It's not normal. I'll keep an eye out for you. If I see anything, I'll let you know." Relief washed over me. I knew I couldn't do this alone. "Thanks, Emily. Just keep it between us. Okay?" She nodded. "Of course." I left the break room, feeling a small surge of satisfaction. The pieces were starting to move, and soon, Emma wouldn't know what hit her, but there was more to be done. Later that morning, I got an email from Ethan. A meeting scheduled for the end of the day, probably to go over the next quarter's plans, the usual business nonsense. But I couldn't help the sick feeling that settled in my gut at the thought of sitting across from him, knowing what I knew. I clenched my fists under the desk, staring at the screen, picturing that smug smile of his. I didn't respond to the email. I didn't need to. When I saw Emma walk into the office around 10 a.m., dressed in one of her best outfits, makeup perfectly done, I felt my resolve harden. She didn't glance my way, just went straight to her desk like I didn't exist. That was fine. Let her think she was in control. Let her think I hadn't figured it all out. Because soon, very soon, I'd make sure the world she'd built with Ethan came crashing down around her. The rest of the day at work felt like I was walking through fog. Everyone else was busy with their own projects, but I was counting the minutes, waiting for that meeting with Ethan. The tension had been building since I walked into the office. Emma, dressed to kill, paraded past my desk without even acknowledging me, as if the confrontation we'd had the night before meant nothing. She was good at that, compartmentalizing, pretending everything was normal when, in reality, everything was spiraling out of control. But I wasn't about to let her dictate the pace anymore. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I had mentally prepared myself for the meeting with Ethan. My heart was pounding in my chest, but not with fear. No, it was anticipation. I wanted to see his face, wanted to see if that smug look would flicker, even for a second, when he realized I wasn't going to play the clueless fool any longer. I walked into the conference room early, taking a seat at the long table. The room was empty except for me, but I could hear voices echoing from the hallway. Emma's laughter, low and casual, followed by Ethan's deeper voice. The sound of them together made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to sit still, to stay calm. This was all part of the plan. Let them walk in thinking they had the upper hand. The door creaked open a moment later, and there they were. Emma entered first, her eyes sweeping the room until they landed on me. For a brief second, I saw something flicker in her gaze. Surprise, maybe even discomfort. But she quickly masked it with her usual work persona. Ethan followed close behind, his signature grin plastered on his face like nothing in the world could touch him. "Mark," Ethan said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Good to see you. Let's get started." Emma didn't sit. She remained standing behind Ethan, her arms crossed, as if she were some sort of enforcer, ready to back him up. I almost laughed at how staged it felt. It was like they had rehearsed this. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Let's cut to the chase," I said, leaning forward. "This meeting isn't really about work, is it?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Mark. We're here to discuss next quarter's targets." I stared directly at him, not breaking eye contact. "We both know that's not why we're here, so why don't you drop the act? It's just the three of us now." For a split second, I saw Ethan's smile falter, the confidence in his eyes flickering. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Emma's face, however, remained unreadable, cold, distant, like she was already calculating her next move. "Mark, I think you're getting a little ahead of yourself," she said, her voice steady but with a sharp edge. "This is business. Let's keep it professional." I almost laughed. Professional? After everything that had happened, she had the nerve to talk about professionalism? The irony wasn't lost on me, and for the first time in days, I felt a surge of control. I wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. "You're right, Emma," I said, leaning back in my chair, my tone calm. "Let's talk business. Specifically, the business of you two sneaking around behind my back." There it was, the bomb I'd been waiting to drop. The air in the room thickened immediately. Ethan's face went pale, his smile disappearing completely. He shot a quick glance at Emma, and for the first time, I saw panic in his eyes. He had underestimated me. They both had. Emma, to her credit, didn't react immediately. She stared at me, stone-faced, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers dug into her crossed arms. "You're being paranoid," she said, her voice icy. "This isn't the time or place for whatever it is you think is happening." I smiled, a real cold smile. Oh, I know exactly what's happening. You think I haven't noticed? The late nights, the whispered conversations, the work trips that you conveniently forget to mention until you're already gone? I have proof, Emma. I've seen the texts. I've seen it all. Ethan looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. His eyes darted between me and Emma, as if searching for an escape route. But there wasn't one. Not this time. You don't know what you're talking about? Ethan stammered, finally finding his voice. Whatever you think you've seen, it's not what it looks like. Oh, really? I said, pulling out my phone and tapping the screen. I had the screenshots ready. I slid the phone across the table toward Ethan, my finger hovering over the first image. One of the more incriminating messages he'd sent Emma late at night. Care to explain this? Ethan didn't even touch the phone. He just stared at it, his face turning red, his hands fidgeting under the table. Emma, meanwhile, stayed completely still, her eyes locked on mine. There was no denying it now. She knew she'd been caught, and for the first time, she didn't have a snappy comeback ready. This isn't a game, Ethan, I said, my voice low and measured. You've crossed a line, both of you, and now, I'm done pretending I don't see it. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a slow scrape across the floor. I don't care how you explain this to HR, or to your wife, Ethan, but don't think for a second that I'm going to sit quietly while you two continue to make a fool out of me. I grabbed my phone, slipping it back into my pocket as I started toward the door. But before I left, I turned back to face them one last time. You might want to check the legal ramifications of sleeping with your subordinate, I added, my eyes on Ethan, watching him squirm in his seat. I'm sure the board would love to know how that affects their bottom line. With that, I walked out, leaving them both sitting there, stunned into silence. I could feel the weight lifting off my chest with every step I took. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. This was just the opening move. But now the game was in my hands. I left that meeting feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. I didn't need their apologies or explanations anymore. The look on Ethan's face, the cold fury in Emma's eyes, that was enough. I turned the tables on them. They thought they could string me along, humiliate me, and get away with it. But now they were scrambling, and I was the one pulling the strings. That evening, I got home before Emma. The house was quiet, almost eerie, but I felt a calm settling in me. This was far from over, but the pieces were moving exactly where I needed them to be. I had proof, I had leverage, and now I just needed to see how they'd react. Would they deny everything? Try to cover it up? Or would Emma finally admit what she'd done? My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. A text from Emily, the coworker I'd confided in. Emily, hey, just thought you should know. Ethan and Emma both left the office early. Seemed pretty shaken up after that meeting. Everyone's talking about it. I couldn't help but smile. Word was already spreading. Good. I wanted them uncomfortable. I wanted them on edge, knowing that at any moment, their entire little scheme could blow up in their faces. I typed a quick reply to Emily, thanking her, and sat back on the couch, waiting. It wasn't long before I heard the front door open. Emma had finally come home, but it wasn't her usual confident stride. Her footsteps were slower, almost hesitant. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't walking into this house like she owned the place. She found me in the living room, sitting there with a glass of whiskey in hand, my phone resting on the coffee table. I didn't stand up or greet her. I just looked at her, waiting for her to speak. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me. The mask she usually wore at home, the perfect, composed wife, was gone. Now, all I saw was someone who knew the walls were closing in. We need to talk, she finally said, her voice flat. I raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of my drink. Do we? She sighed, walking over to the armchair across from me and sitting down. She didn't meet my eyes at first, just stared at the floor, her hands clenched together in her lap. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how to play this. But I wasn't going to make it easy for her. You embarrassed me in front of Ethan today, she said, her voice sharper now. You crossed a line. I almost laughed. I crossed a line? After everything? Emma, you've been crossing lines for months. I just finally decided to point it out. She glared at me, but there was a flicker of something else behind her eyes. Panic. You don't understand what's going on, Mark. Then enlighten me, I said, leaning forward, my voice cold. Tell me why I've had to watch my wife flirt with her boss, sneak around behind my back, and lie to my face for months. Tell me how you think any of this is justifiable. She didn't respond immediately, her jaw tightening as she fought to maintain control of the conversation. It's complicated, she finally said, her voice quieter now. Ethan and I, it's not what you think. Oh, it's exactly what I think. I shot back, my voice steady. You don't get to play the "it's complicated" card, Emma. I've seen the texts, the messages. I know exactly what's been going on. Her face went pale. She hadn't expected me to have proof, hadn't counted on me digging deeper than her lies. Mark, she started, her tone shifting to something softer, almost pleading. It was just a distraction. It didn't mean anything. Things between us haven't been the same, and I interrupted, raising my hand to stop her. Don't you dare try to make this about us. You had choices. You could have talked to me, you could have told me something was wrong. But instead, you chose to lie. You chose to sleep with your boss and humiliate me in front of the entire office. She flinched at that, but I wasn't done. I was good to you, Emma. We've had our problems. Sure, but I was always there, always trying to make it work. And you decided I wasn't enough. So don't sit there and act like you were forced into this. You chose this. For a moment, she looked like she was going to argue, but the fight drained from her eyes. She slumped back in the chair, her hands trembling slightly. I never meant for it to get this far. I stared at her, the anger boiling inside me, but also the sadness. I didn't recognize her anymore. The woman I fell in love with was gone, replaced by this cold, calculating person who had torn our marriage apart. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How long have you been with him? She hesitated, but when she saw I wasn't going to back down, she finally answered. A few months. It started after that business trip to Chicago. I don't know what happened, Mark. I was frustrated. I felt trapped, and Ethan was there. I felt a hollow pit in my chest at her words. The business trip. That was when she first started pulling away, when the late nights became more frequent, when the lies started piling up. And you were just going to keep going, weren't you? I asked bitterly. Keep playing house with me while you had him on the side? I didn't know what else to do, she snapped, finally losing her composure. I was confused, okay? I didn't want to blow up our life, but things with you and me were falling apart. And Ethan, he made me feel wanted. There it was. The truth, raw and ugly, laid bare between us. I'm filing for divorce, I said flatly, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. Emma's eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real fear on her face. Mark, wait, we can fix this. I'll end things with Ethan. We can go to counseling, try to. No, I said, standing up and looking down at her. It's too late for that. You made your choice, Emma. Now you can live with it. I turned to leave the room, but before I did, I stopped and looked back at her one last time. And don't think this ends with us. Ethan's got a lot more to lose than just a marriage. With that, I walked out, leaving her sitting there in stunned silence. The ball was in her court now, but whatever she did next, it didn't matter. I was done with her lies, and I wasn't going down without a fight. The dominoes had started falling, and there was no turning back. That I didn't sleep that night. Not a minute. After the confrontation with Emma, I left the house, unable to be around her, the weight of everything suffocating me. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to outrun the anger, the betrayal, the sadness that had taken root in my chest. But no matter how far I went, it clung to me, tightening like a vice. By the time dawn broke, I found myself parked outside a coffee shop, staring at the dashboard, my mind racing with all the next steps I'd need to take. I couldn't go back to how things were, and I couldn't let Emma or Ethan walk away from this unscathed. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, making sure neither of them could play me for a fool ever again. When I finally returned home, it was early, the sun barely up. Emma was in the kitchen, sitting at the table, a half-drunk cup of coffee in front of her. She looked like she hadn't slept either, her face pale, eyes red from either lack of rest or tears. I didn't care which. She glanced up as I walked in but didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. We both knew what was coming. I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, my movements slow, deliberate, trying to stay calm. I could feel her watching me, but I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of starting another argument. I finally broke the silence. "I've spoken to my lawyer." Her expression tightened. "Mark, can't we?" "No." I interrupted, my voice firm. "This isn't up for discussion. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm not changing my mind." Emma's eyes fell to the table, her fingers nervously tapping the side of her coffee cup. "I don't want things to end like this," she whispered, but the fight was gone from her voice. She knew she'd lost. "I didn't either," I replied, softer now, but still resolute. "But you made your choice." The silence between us was thick, heavy with the weight of everything we had left unsaid. I didn't hate her, not exactly. I just couldn't look at her without feeling that deep, hollow ache in my chest. The love we once had was gone, and all that remained was the mess she had created. She finally stood up, walking toward the sink to pour out her coffee. "So, what happens now?" I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face, exhausted beyond words. "I'm leaving. I'll stay somewhere else until we figure out the legal stuff. I'll have the papers drawn up by the end of the week." She didn't respond, just nodded, her back still turned to me. I grabbed my keys, shoved a few essentials into a bag, and left without another word. The house no longer felt like mine. It was just a space filled with broken promises and lies. I drove to a friend's place, someone I hadn't seen in a while, but who had always had my back. When I told him what happened, he was shocked but not surprised. "Man, I never trusted Ethan," he said, shaking his head. "That guy always seemed like trouble. And Emma, well, I didn't think she'd go this far, but I knew something was up. I appreciated the solidarity, but there wasn't much comfort in it." I spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to process everything, but my thoughts kept returning to Ethan. It wasn't enough for me to just divorce Emma. I needed to make sure Ethan didn't walk away from this without consequences. He had manipulated the situation, used his power over Emma, and humiliated me in front of the entire office. There was no way I was letting him get away with that. That evening, I sat down and started making calls. First, I spoke to my lawyer again, asking him to speed up the process with the divorce papers and to look into any potential legal actions I could take against Ethan. Then I reached out to a few trusted people in the office, coworkers who had seen things, who had noticed the way Ethan and Emma had been acting. If I was going to take him down, I needed evidence, and I knew just where to start digging. The next morning, I was back at the office, but this time with a purpose. I wasn't there to work. I was there to gather the ammunition I needed to make sure Ethan's career and reputation took the hit it deserved. I started with HR. Walking into that department felt like stepping into enemy territory, but I kept my expression neutral, my tone calm. "I need to file a formal complaint," I said to the HR manager, a no-nonsense woman named Karen who had been with the company for years. She raised an eyebrow but gestured for me to sit down. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice professional but wary. "It's about Ethan," I said, leaning forward slightly. "He's been having an affair with one of his subordinates, my wife, Emma. It's been going on for months, and I have proof." Karen's face went from curious to serious in an instant. "You have proof?" I nodded, sliding the folder across the desk. Screenshots, messages, times they'd left the office together, all neatly compiled. I watched her expression harden as she flipped through the evidence, her mouth set in a tight line. "This is serious," she said finally, looking up at me. "You understand that this will likely escalate to the board, right? Ethan is high up in the company, but if this is true, well, there could be severe consequences." That's exactly what I'm counting on, I replied, my voice steady. She nodded, closing the folder and standing up. We'll conduct an investigation, and if what you're saying checks out, we'll take the necessary steps. But this won't be quick. These things take time. I understand, I said, rising to my feet. I'm not in a rush. I just want this to be handled properly. As I left her office, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It wasn't over, not yet, but the ball was rolling. Ethan had no idea what was coming, and I was more than happy to let the system he'd tried to use against me turn on him. Later that afternoon, I got a text from Emily again. Emily, heard HR sniffing around. Ethan's acting weird. I think he knows something's up. Good. Let him sweat. Emma hadn't contacted me since I left the house. And honestly, I was relieved. I wasn't ready to deal with her again. Not yet. I needed to see how this would play out with Ethan first. Needed to see how far I could push before everything came crashing down. The storm was coming, and I was ready to watch them both drown. The next few days felt like the calm before the storm. Ethan and Emma kept their distance at work, and the tension in the office was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. The whispers, the glances, the curiosity. They knew something was brewing, but nobody knew how deep the cracks ran. Ethan avoided me like the plague, which was a far cry from the smugness he used to walk around with. He barely even glanced my way, and when he did, it was quick, like he was afraid I'd catch him in the act. But it didn't matter. I wasn't just here to watch him squirm. I was waiting for the moment when everything collapsed around him. It didn't take long. By midweek, I got the call I'd been waiting for. HR was ready to move. Karen had set up a formal review, and Ethan was about to be called in. The investigation was real, and I knew that once it started, the fallout would be immediate. The company had strict policies on workplace relationships, especially when it came to managers and their subordinates. And with the proof I'd given them, Ethan's reputation and career were on borrowed time. The meeting was scheduled for the afternoon. I had no reason to be there, but I made sure to stay close enough to see him walk in. I stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall, pretending to be on my phone as Ethan approached the HR office. He looked nervous, more than nervous. He looked like a man walking to his execution. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a tight jaw and sweat beading at his temple. As he passed me, our eyes met for a brief second. There was no smile this time, no cocky smirk, just a cold, desperate look that screamed one thing. He knew. I watched him walk into Karen's office, the door closing behind him, and I felt the faintest stir of satisfaction. This was it. Ethan had built his career on power plays, on manipulating the people around him, but now he was trapped, and I had the keys to his downfall. I went back to my desk, my mind buzzing with the thought of what was happening behind that closed door. Ethan would be grilled, asked to explain the texts, the meetings, the favoritism he'd shown Emma. I knew the company couldn't ignore the evidence I'd provided. There was no way he could talk his way out of this. A few hours later, I got confirmation that the hammer had dropped. Emily texted me, her excitement palpable even through the phone. Emily, he's done. HR's talking about separation already. He might even get fired by the end of the week. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting it sink in. It was happening. The plan was unfolding exactly as I'd hoped. Ethan's days at the company were numbered, and Emma's world was about to come crashing down with him. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I kept to myself, not wanting to draw attention, but the energy in the office was buzzing. Word had started spreading that something was going down with Ethan. People whispered in hushed voices as they walked by his office, throwing glances at me, trying to piece together what had happened. They'd know soon enough. As the workday ended, I headed to the parking lot, ready to go home. Well, not home. To my friend's place, where I'd been staying since I left Emma. I was unlocking my car when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. I'd been expecting this. Mark. Her voice was low, almost shaking. I turned to face her, and there she was, Emma, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by desperation. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, not meeting my eyes. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely holding together. I sighed, leaning against my car. "About what, Emma?" "There's nothing left to say." She took a shaky breath, stepping closer. "Please, I know you went to HR. I know what you're doing. But Mark, you don't understand. You're blowing everything up." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was the one blowing things up? "I'm blowing things up?" I repeated, my voice calm but with an edge. "Emma, you had an affair with your boss. You lied to me, humiliated me, and now you're upset because I won't let you get away with it." She winced, her hands gripping tighter around her arms. "It wasn't like that, Mark. It just happened. Ethan and I. Don't—" I cut her off, my voice hard. "Don't try to justify it. You made your choices, Emma. Now you can deal with the consequences." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she looked like she was going to break down right there in the parking lot. But I didn't move. I didn't reach out to comfort her. I'd done that too many times before. This time, she had to face the reality of what she'd done. "They're going to fire him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're going to fire Ethan. And then what? What happens to us?" That word hit me harder than I expected. She was still holding on to the idea that there was an us, that somehow, after everything, we could still salvage something from the wreckage. But there was no us anymore. Not after what she'd done. Not after what I knew. "There is no us," I said quietly, looking her in the eyes. "You made sure of that." She stared at me, the tears finally spilling over, her face crumpling in defeat. "Mark, please. I know I messed up, but don't do this. Don't destroy everything. I'll leave him. I'll quit the job if that's what it takes. We can start over. Please." I shook my head, cutting her off. "It's too late, Emma. You crossed the line, and there's no going back." For a moment, she just stood there, her tears falling silently. I could see the realization dawning on her, the weight of what she'd lost. The game she and Ethan had played was over, and now she had to live with the fallout. Without another word, I opened my car door and got in. I didn't look back as I pulled out of the lot, leaving her standing there, alone with everything crashing down around her. The next day, the news broke. Ethan had resigned from the company. Of course, it wasn't a real resignation. Everyone knew he'd been forced out. His career was in tatters, and there was no salvaging it. As for Emma, she stayed on at the company for now, but her reputation was in ruins. I knew it wasn't over. Divorce papers were still coming, and the mess was far from cleaned up. But for the first time in weeks, I felt free. The weight of the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation, it was all lifting. I wasn't just Mark, the fool who had been played by his wife and her boss. I was Mark, the man who had taken control of his life back. The storm had passed, and I had survived.